They buried the wrong priest. That's what the boy had whispered from his fevered bed on the eve of his death in 1911, 60 years after the first altar boy disappeared from St. Joseph's Church. His tongue had been cut out during the fire that consumed Sacred Heart's orphanage. And yet, as the nurses turned to change his bandages, they heard him speak, clear as a bell. He said the words that cracked open a silence older than the graves beneath the church. They buried the wrong priest. What happened in western Pennsylvania between 1847 and 1853 wasn't a tragedy born of misfortune or a mystery buried in time. It was a ritual, a system of selection, of sacrifice, and of silence. A design so meticulously executed that it left no trace behind, except for the dates, the patterns, and the sickening consistency with which the evidence was made to vanish. Fires that spared everything but the one room with answers. Families that forgot. Witnesses who never came forward. And now, a sealed, lead-lined box buried under a forgotten municipal building, discovered only by accident, as if it had been waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to ask the right questions. You weren't supposed to know this. You weren't supposed to hear these names, read these pages, or see these photographs. But if you're still listening, if you're still here, you're not just a viewer. You're a witness. And once you hear what really happened to the 14 altar boys of St. Joseph's Church, you won't walk into any house of God without first looking down at the floor and wondering what might be underneath. This isn't a story. It's not entertainment. It's a map, a door, a descent. And it doesn't open unless you're willing to change. Because once you see what's behind it, you can't unsee it. You will hear things that shift the way you remember your childhood. Your trust in authority. Your belief in the people we were all taught to obey. What's coming isn't safe. It never was. So ask yourself now, how deep are you willing to go? Because the deeper we go, the less we're allowed to pretend. And once we crack the first seal, we don't stop. Not until the illusion has bled. Not until the altar has split. And not until the mask of holiness tears away to reveal the ancient face underneath. Still watching. Still hungry. It began, as many horrors do, with a man who knew how to wear trust like a second skin. When Father Cornelius O'Malley arrived in Sacred Heart in the fall of 1845, the people of that small coal mining town saw him not just as a priest, but as a blessing delivered straight from the hands of God. He was tall, dignified, with silver hair that shimmered in the candlelight and eyes the color of ice. His voice carried the cadence of Dublin's finest seminaries, and his sermons could silence even the loudest children, the devout Irish immigrants. Weary from labor and rejection, found in him a father figure who made their suffering feel sacred, who told them that God saw their struggle and would reward their obedience. O'Malley arrived with the perfect credentials. Letters bearing the seal of Bishop Francis Kenrick, glowing recommendations from parishes in Baltimore and Boston. And a solemn explanation for his sudden reassignment. The previous priest, Father McKenna, had died unexpectedly, peacefully, as if heaven had simply called him home. No autopsy, no questions. Just a quiet burial and a grateful congregation eager to believe that their prayers had been answered. Within weeks, O'Malley had transformed the spiritual life of the community. He revitalized the liturgy, introduced elaborate rituals, and most importantly, established a formal altar boy program, something Father McKenna had never attempted. The parents welcomed it as a miracle. In a time when most boys were destined for the mines or the mills, the chance to serve at the altar offered a glimpse of dignity and education. O'Malley told them it was a sacred path, a narrow road that only the purest could walk. He selected the boys himself, claiming to sense spiritual potential in their hearts, and he trained them personally in the rituals of service. They were taught to recite Latin prayers with perfect cadence, to handle the chalice and censer with reverence, and to carry themselves with the humility of saints. To the outside eye, it was a model parish, devout, disciplined, alive with faith. But something else was alive there too. It lived in the shadows beneath the church, in the eyes of the boys who began to change slowly, quietly, until they no longer spoke of games or mischief, but of secrets, sacred secrets, things that could not be repeated outside of their brotherhood. The adults saw discipline, growth, spiritual awakening. But the boys were learning something else, entirely something older than the church. And far more dangerous. The first to vanish was Michael Flanagan. He was 12 years old, the baker's son, a quiet boy with a sharp memory and a reverence for ritual that made him Father O'Malley's favorite apprentice. On the morning of March 19th, 1847, the feast of St. Joseph Michael was selected to assist with the dawn mass. A high honor in a community where piety and obedience meant everything. His mother watched him walk the frost-covered path to the church, his white surplice gleaming, his breath curling like smoke in the cold air. She expected him home within 2 hours, as she always did. But that morning stretched into afternoon, then into evening, and Michael never came home. At first, the community responded with alarmed devotion. Search parties were organized, prayers were offered, and the cold hills around Sacred Heart echoed with the sound of his name. Men dragged the stream beds, scoured abandoned mine shafts, and checked every wagon that had passed through town that morning. But there was nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint in the soft ground behind the church. When Father O'Malley returned from his supposed trip to Pittsburgh that evening, he expressed grave concern, spoke of meetings with the bishop, and claimed that Michael had stayed behind for an overnight vigil, an act of private penance for sins too grave to speak aloud. What followed was the first sleight of hand in a long pattern of misdirection. O'Malley gathered the townspeople and shared a story that reshaped their grief into shame. Michael, he said, had confessed to stealing communion wine, mocking the Mass, and leading Protestant boys in blasphemous games. He had failed not only the church, but his community. The implication was clear. Michael's disappearance was not tragedy, but consequence. A fall from grace. A boy lost, not to violence, but to sin. The parents wept not for his safety, but for his soul. The brilliance of O'Malley's manipulation was not just in what he said, but in what he left unsaid. Who would search for a child whose holiness had been called into question? Who would want to believe that something darker had taken him? When the priest offered such a clean, righteous narrative, and so, Michael Flanagan became a warning. A ghost no one could speak of without confessing doubt in the very institution that held their fragile world together. But not everyone was willing to accept the story. Margaret O'Brien, the church cleaner and lifelong parishioner, had always known when something felt off, even if she didn't have the words to explain it. On the morning of Michael's disappearance, she arrived early to prepare for the feast day mass and immediately noticed details that didn't align with Father O'Malley's account. The boy's prayer book, his most prized possession, was lying on the floor of the sacristy, its leather binding stained with something dark and sticky that didn't smell like wine. The altar candles were burned almost to their bases. Wax pooled in strange patterns, as if they had been moved and rearranged throughout the night. and the basement door, which had remained locked since the death of Father McKenna, stood slightly ajar, a faint, foul sweetness rising from the stone stairwell like breath from a grave. She mentioned these things to O'Malley, her voice tentative, searching for reassurance. But instead of comfort, she received a warning. His gaze turned cold, his tone soft but heavy with weight. "Gossip is the devil's tool, Margaret," he said. "And in times of grief, even good people become vulnerable to temptation." He told her that the odors she smelled came from incense used in the blessing of sacred relics, that the locked door had been opened for holy purposes, that her speculations, if repeated, could harm the community more than any sin Michael may have committed. And then, almost as an afterthought, he reminded her that bearing false witness against a priest was not only sinful, it was excommunicable. Margaret said nothing more after that. But she began to write things down. A candle that wouldn't stay lit. A hymn book missing a page, replaced with symbols she didn't recognize. Strange footsteps echoing beneath the stone floor during early morning prayers. She didn't know what she was seeing, not yet, but something inside her knew to start keeping a record. Not because she thought anyone would believe her, but because the silence that followed Michael's disappearance wasn't just grief. It was fear. A cold, very quiet kind of fear that wrapped around the parish like smoke, seeping into the minds of every parent, every neighbor, every boy still serving at the altar. The months that followed were soaked in a kind of spiritual haze, thick with sermons about obedience, sin, and the invisible war for the soul. Father O'Malley's presence grew even more commanding in the wake of Michael's disappearance. He delivered homilies that seemed less about God and more about control, weaving fear into Scripture with surgical precision. He warned of spiritual predators who wore familiar faces, of temptations that lived inside doubt itself. But no one noticed the irony. Or if they did, they were too afraid to speak. The altar boy program, far from shrinking in the face of tragedy, expanded. O'Malley introduced stricter discipline, private lessons, and a renewed emphasis on spiritual refinement, a word he used often, though never fully explained. Parents continued sending their sons, more eager than ever to prove their family's faithfulness. After all, O'Malley had painted Michael not as a victim, but as a cautionary tale. And fear, when given a righteous face, can do the bidding of evil more efficiently than cruelty ever could. The priest's power swelled in the vacuum of silence. The church basement, once thought too hazardous for use, became the sacred heart of his new instruction. Boys went in alone and came out quiet, distant. They spoke of sacred symbols, special rites, and whispered prayers they couldn't repeat. They became serious. Some would say enlightened. Others, if pressed, would admit they seemed hollowed. Tommy Sullivan was the next to fall under O'Malley's shadow. He was 10, clever, and devout, known for reciting prayers backwards just to amuse his younger siblings. But by late winter, he no longer joked. He no longer played. He would come home from his training with wide, vacant eyes, speaking in cryptic phrases about sacrifice and silence. When his mother, Mary, asked what he had learned, he would only smile and say that Father O'Malley had shown him the true church, the one behind the veil, the one that came before Rome, before Jerusalem, before even Bethlehem. No one understood what that meant, and no one dared to ask. Because by then, the fear wasn't just inside the church. It had become the church. Exactly 1 year after Michael Flanagan vanished, on the feast of St. Joseph, 1848, Tommy Sullivan failed to return from an overnight vigil supposedly held in the church basement. O'Malley explained that the boy had been selected for a special mission, a divine calling of such importance that even his parents were not permitted to know the details. He claimed that Tommy had been summoned by Bishop Kenrick to assist in establishing Catholic communities across the Western Territories of Ohio. Indiana, perhaps farther. The boy's departure, he said, was so urgent and sacred that secrecy was essential. He produced official-looking papers sealed with wax, covered in flowing ecclesiastical script that few could read, and assured Mary and Patrick Sullivan that their son was safe, chosen, and honored beyond comprehension. But something inside Mary rebelled against the comfort of that story. The last time she saw Tommy, he had hugged her with trembling arms and whispered something she couldn't fully understand, something about a voice in the dark that wasn't Father O'Malley's. She clutched that memory like a thread in a burning house. And then there was the wooden cross, hand-carved by her own father, that Tommy never removed from around his neck. Margaret O'Brien found it in the sacristy the next morning, lying near the foot of the basement stairwell. O'Malley said Tommy had left it intentionally, a symbol of spiritual anchoring, but Margaret knew better. That cross was protection, a tether. You don't leave it behind when walking into darkness, unless you know you won't be coming back. And so the cycle deepened. Another child gone, another ceremony performed. But this time, the grief of the community was coated with something else shame. Doubt. It lingered in glances exchanged between parents, in the careful hush that settled over conversations when O'Malley passed by. Some mothers noticed that their sons were thinner. Some fathers couldn't ignore the vacant looks in their boys' eyes, but they said nothing. Because what would they say that the priest who had buried their dead and baptized their children might be something else entirely in a town built on faith? Doubt was blasphemy. And O'Malley had made sure that blasphemy was the one sin no one dared commit. By the spring of 1849, the silence in Sacred Heart was no longer passive, it was enforced. Father O'Malley's sermons had grown more intense, laced with imagery that bordered on apocalyptic. He spoke of a war between unseen forces, of holy bloodlines and ancient oaths, of trials that must be endured by the faithful in order to claim their reward in the world to come. He warned the congregation of heretical whispers, of spiritual saboteurs who might try to lure them away from the path through suspicion and pride. The implication was never direct, but it didn't have to be. Everyone understood that questioning the altar boy disappearances, now 3 and counting, was to side with darkness. To doubt O'Malley was to doubt God's chosen vessel, behind the curtain of sanctity. However, the pattern was hardening into something unmistakable. Each boy who vanished had spent increasing amounts of time alone with the priest. Each had spoken cryptically of sacred knowledge, of rituals older than Christianity, of voices they could not name but were commanded to obey. Their behavior followed a chilling trajectory: increased isolation, emotional numbness, unexplained physical symptoms, and then, finally, disappearance. Always around the Feast of St. Joseph, always preceded by a private vigil in the church basement, and always followed by the appearance of documents, testimonies, and stories so carefully constructed they left just enough room for belief that the church still had control. But even the most ironclad stories begin to crack under the weight of dread. Kathleen Murphy, whose son Danny had recently begun his altar boy training, was among the first to quietly push back. Her son, once talkative and cheerful, had become solemn, secretive, and sleepless. He claimed to be fine. He said he was learning to listen, but he flinched when touched and stared too long at things that weren't there. Kathleen confronted O'Malley just once. She asked him what kind of prayers required children to be kept in basements for hours on end. He answered with a smile and a passage from the Gospel of Matthew: "The kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force." Then he placed his hand on her shoulder and told her that mothers who interfere in sacred work rarely understand the damage they cause. By the end of that year, 5 altar boys had vanished. Their names were still whispered in kitchens and behind closed doors. But only in sorrow, never in anger. No one dared connect the dots out loud. The grief was too heavy, and the fear too intimate. O'Malley's power had metastasized, no longer just religious, but psychological. He had become a mirror into which the town stared and saw only what he allowed. His rituals grew more elaborate. Midnight services attended only by altar boys, extended fasts said to cleanse the spiritual vessel, and long, silent walks through the cemetery, always ending at the locked mausoleum near the back of the grounds. Parents were told these practices came from the oldest traditions of the church rites, forgotten by modern parishes, but preserved by the most devout. Patrick Donnelly, the blacksmith's son, was O'Malley's newest prize. 16 years old, articulate, deeply devout, the kind of boy who once dreamed of joining the priesthood. He had been with O'Malley more than any other boy in the previous year, and his transformation was swift and unsettling. His speech became formal, archaic. He quoted texts that weren't in any local catechism and referenced saints no one had heard of. He no longer laughed, no longer joined the others after Mass, and at times seemed to forget the names of his own siblings. He began waking from nightmares, drenched in sweat, babbling about rooms beneath the stone, about eyes behind the wall, about a voice that spoke not in words, but in understanding. It was Patrick who finally broke the silence. One February night in 1851, he locked the door behind him and told his father the truth, or at least, as much of the truth as his fraying mind could hold together. He described chambers beneath the church that didn't exist on any blueprint, carved into living rock, their walls covered in symbols that pulsed when touched. He spoke of the old Mass, a ritual taught not in Rome, but in some place deeper, colder, older. He said he'd seen the missing boys alive, but changed, moving in perfect unison, eyes reflecting candlelight like animal glass, voices overlapping in languages that never learned how to be spoken. "They're not dead," Patrick whispered, "but they're not ours anymore." James Donnelly sat in silence after hearing his son's confession, his rough hands trembling as if from deep winter chill. A man of coal and hammer, not imagination. He had spent his life grounding himself in the weight of steel and stone. But nothing could prepare him for the quiet horror etched in Patrick's face. The hollowed look of a boy who had seen something that had no name. Patrick spoke of chants that reversed your thoughts, of candles that flickered against walls where shadows moved the wrong way. He said Father O'Malley had begun referring to him as the vessel, that he was being prepared for some kind of transformation, something final, and that once it happened, there would be no returning, not for him, not for anyone. He said the time is close, Patrick whispered. He said March 19th is the door. James didn't sleep that night. He waited until dawn and then rode through the biting wind to speak with 2 men he trusted, Sean O'Connor and Michael Walsh, both fathers of altar boys who had shown similar signs of spiritual deterioration. In the flickering lamplight of Donnelly's kitchen, they shared what none of them had dared voice before stories of footsteps heard beneath the chapel after midnight. Children speaking in tongues in their sleep, strange burn marks on their skin in symmetrical, deliberate patterns. Walsh confessed that his son, Timothy, had recently begun waking with blood on his sheets and no memory of injury. O'Connor admitted he had seen movement in the cemetery on moonless nights, figures in robes, carrying shapes too small to be adults, vanishing into the mausoleum. All 3 men stared at one another, the truth now fully unshackled between them, vibrating in the quiet, like a tuning fork pressed against bone. They knew they couldn't go to the sheriff, not only because he was Protestant and likely to dismiss their claims, but because nothing they had was evidence in the way the world recognized. What they had was fear, suspicion, testimony too dark to say out loud without the room itself feeling changed. But they couldn't wait any longer. They made a pact on the night of March 15th, 4 days before the feast of St. Joseph. They would watch the church themselves, not as parishioners, not as men of faith, but as fathers, standing between their sons and whatever had learned to wear a collar. The night of March 15th, 1851 arrived like a breath held too long. The air was brittle with frost, the sky moonless, and the trees surrounding St. Joseph's stood like silent witnesses to a truth too long buried. James Donnelly, Sean O'Connor, and Michael Walsh took their positions in the woods and graveyards surrounding the church. Oil lamps dimmed, weapons hidden beneath their coats, not because they expected violence, but because something deep inside them, older than reason, whispered that protection must come in steel. For 3 hours, they watched in silence, the stillness broken only by the distant cry of an animal or the creak of wood shifting under wind. Then, just after 2 in the morning, the basement windows of the church began to glow, first amber, then white, then a deep, pulsing red that seemed to throb in time with something none of them could hear but all of them felt. The chanting came next, not Gregorian, not Latin, not anything sacred they had ever heard. It was layered, polyphonic, constructed of syllables that didn't belong in the human mouth. The rhythm was off, not chaotic, but wrong, too symmetrical, too clean. Underneath it, they heard drums, only it wasn't drums. It was deeper, wetter, like something being struck that was never meant to make sound. James crept closer to the side entrance Patrick had described, finding the old wooden door slightly ajar and a wave of warm, sweet, sick air spilling into the cold night. He descended alone, heart pounding so loudly he thought it might betray him. Down the stone steps, past the threshold where prayers didn't seem to matter anymore, into a place no consecrated ground should ever hold. The basement had changed. The walls were etched with symbols that shimmered as if sweating light, and the flicker of candles placed in impossible geometries cast shadows that didn't follow the laws of flame. In the center stood a black altar, polished and gleaming, surrounded by 7 hooded figures. James recognized them instantly. Michael, Tommy, Liam, the lost boys. Their eyes glowed faintly in the flickering light. And when they moved as one, their heads turning in perfect synchrony toward a man standing at the head of the circle, Father O'Malley. But it wasn't O'Malley anymore. His face was the same, but something behind it had torn through, like a mask stretched too tight over something vast, ancient and ravenous. James Donnelly didn't breathe. He couldn't. What stood at the head of that black altar wore the shape of a man, but moved like an idea fluid, abstract, bending light in subtle ways that made the eye ache. O'Malley's eyes were no longer blue, but pitch black, wide and unblinking, reflecting the flickering flames like glass over still water. His voice came in layers, one high, one low, and a third that didn't seem to come from the air at all, but from somewhere behind James's own thoughts. He raised his arms and spoke words that turned to James's stomach, syllables so precise they seemed to carve through the walls themselves. The altar boys responded in harmony, their mouths moving, their voices blending into a song that didn't belong to this world. Their skin was pale, their eyes unfocused, and their limbs moved with the elegance of puppets guided by invisible strings. James saw his own son among them. Patrick, his face caught between memory and something unspeakably altered. The boy's lips parted in worship. but his hands trembled slightly, just enough for his father to see the human still flickering beneath the mask. And that flicker, that fragile thread of familiarity, was enough to shatter James's paralysis. He stepped back too quickly. His boot struck a loose stone and sent it clattering across the chamber floor like a shot through still water. 7 heads turned instantly. O'Malley's voice ceased. The air changed, thickened. For a moment, the only sound was the low hiss of wax against flame. Then O'Malley spoke a single word. Short, guttural, impossible, and the altar boys began to move toward the shadows where James stood. Not with speed, but with certainty, their feet gliding, their arms limp, their eyes locked forward like they saw through walls. James turned and fled, panic clawing at his throat as he scrambled back up the stairs, the sound of something wet and heavy scraping along the floor behind him. He burst through the side door and into the icy air just as Sean and Michael emerged from their own hiding spots, their faces pale with horror, shouting over each other about figures in the graveyard, about voices they'd heard that spoke from underground, about lights that didn't cast shadows. They ran, all 3 of them, into the woods, past the fence line, beyond the reach of candlelight and chanting. They didn't stop until the sun broke over the horizon. And even then, the fear clung to them like a second skin because they now knew what lived beneath St. Joseph's. And worse, they knew it was not yet finished. The men returned home, shaken, not just by what they had seen, but by the knowledge that there was no clear path forward. What could they tell their wives, their neighbors? That a priest they had followed for 6 years was something else, something wearing skin like vestments and speaking in a language that peeled the air itself. No one would believe them. Not yet. And yet, the silence was no longer an option. That morning, as James washed the dried sweat and candle soot from his hand, he looked into the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. He wasn't just afraid. He was changed. Something had shifted inside him, something permanent. And it wasn't just dread. It was purpose. They agreed to wait until March 19th, the Feast of St. Joseph, the anniversary of Michael Flanagan's disappearance. Whatever ritual O'Malley was preparing had a pattern, and they were sure that day would mark its culmination. They would not stop it, not without being labeled mad or worse, but they could expose it. Walsh retrieved an old camera, one he'd once used for portraits, and purchased fresh glass plates from a town 2 days away. Sean O'Connor began keeping a journal, documenting everything he'd seen in explicit detail. James, meanwhile, focused on Patrick, watching his son carefully, gently, trying to coax out more of what had happened without pushing him further into the darkness. The boy spoke less now. He sat for hours without moving. Sometimes he hummed melodies that didn't sound like hymns at all, but rather distant echoes of something older, hollow and cold. What haunted James most were the few words Patrick had muttered just before falling into one of his long, trance-like silences. "He says the others are ready," the boy whispered. "He says I'm the gate." James didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. Whatever O'Malley had been building beneath St. Joseph's wasn't just for control, it was a vessel for transformation, a kind of spiritual harvest. And Patrick, his first and brightest pupil, was meant to be the final seal, the one who would open the door and never walk back through it. That knowledge became James Donnelly's fuel. Because now he wasn't just fighting to reveal the truth, he was racing against it. The final days before the feast passed like the last breath before drowning quiet on the surface. But thick with pressure. Sacred Heart moved through its rituals with the kind of robotic grace that only fear can teach. Families polished their pews, washed altar cloths, and prepared for celebration. But there was no joy in it, only duty. O'Malley's sermons had grown quieter, but heavier, like stones dropped into still water. He no longer needed to thunder from the pulpit. His control was complete. The town didn't follow him out of inspiration anymore. They followed because questioning had become impossible. To resist was to exile yourself, not just from the church, but from your name, your family, your very identity as part of Sacred Heart. And for poor immigrants who had already lost everything once, that threat was enough. Inside the rectory, preparations intensified. The basement, once whispered about with discomfort, had been rebranded as the sacred chamber of initiation. Candles were ordered in bulk. Boxes of linens arrived from nowhere. And the altar boys, those who remained, were seen less and less in daylight. Patrick was among them. James would hear him rise at night, walking barefoot across the wooden floorboards like a sleepwalker pulled by a tide only he could feel. Once, James followed. He found his son standing in the yard, barefoot in the snow, eyes fixed on the church steeple, mouth moving in soundless rhythm. When James spoke his name, Patrick didn't turn. He only said, "It's almost time." "Da." He says the veil's thinnest when the bell rings 13. No one remembered St. Joseph's bell ringing 13 times. It was an oddity, a mechanical impossibility. But deep down, James believed it. Because by then, reality no longer obeyed its own rules. Shadows were stretching too far. Time felt staggered, like the hours hung too long in the afternoon and collapsed too fast at night. Even the animals had changed. The birds were silent. The dogs refused to approach the church grounds. And every morning, the frost on the church windows bore patterns too precise, too symmetrical, to be natural. O'Malley had shaped Sacred Heart into something else, something not entirely of this world. And unless someone tore back the veil, it would become permanent. The morning of March 19th, 1851 arrived beneath a sky too still to be trusted. No wind stirred, no birds sang. The light seemed diffused, colorless, as if the sun were shining through ash rather than cloud. At St. Joseph's Church, the congregation gathered early, dressed in their finest as always. But their faces bore a tightness that celebration could not explain. The children were unusually quiet, their eyes downcast, and the altar boys, those few who remained, moved with a fluidity that made the hairs on the back of James Donnelly's neck rise. They didn't speak. They didn't smile. They simply obeyed, like actors in a play too old to remember being written. O'Malley greeted his flock with a warmth so practiced it felt embalmed. He thanked them for their continued devotion, praised their steadfast faith, and announced that this year's feast of St. Joseph would be marked by a special midnight liturgy, an ancient rite, said to invoke the intercession of the saints in times of spiritual trial. Only the pure may witness it, he said, eyes scanning the crowd with that predator's calm. Only those untainted by doubt. The words fell like stones into the room, and no one dared move. James, from his place near the back, clenched his fists. He had no idea what would happen that night. But he knew one thing for certain: if he allowed his son to step into that chamber again, he might never come back out. That afternoon, while the town busied itself with preparations, James met privately with Bishop Francis Kenrick. The bishop, to James's astonishment, had arrived unannounced that morning, accompanied by 2 other priests and a retinue of clerical assistants. James didn't know who had contacted the diocese or why they had chosen now. But it didn't matter. he didn't waste time with pleasantries. In a voice low and urgent, he laid out everything what he'd seen in the basement, what Patrick had told him, what they had witnessed 2 nights earlier. He expected disbelief. Instead, Kenrick listened in grim silence, nodding once when James finished, then handing him a sealed envelope. "You're not the first," the bishop said quietly, "but with God's help, you might be the last." As night fell over Sacred Heart, the stillness thickened into something oppressive, like the hush before a storm that never quite arrives. The town gathered once more in the sanctuary of St. Joseph's, unaware that a reckoning had already begun. Bishop Kenrick sat among them, robed but quiet, his presence understated by design. His assistants mingled with the crowd, observing, listening, noting who smiled too easily and who kept glancing toward the altar. James Donnelly remained close to Patrick, though the boy barely seemed to register his presence. Patrick's hands twitched occasionally, his lips moving in silent rehearsal of words no one else understood. The ritual had already begun for him, and James feared it might already be too late. At precisely midnight, the church bell rang once, twice, then 3 times more, but when it reached the 12th toll, there was a pause. An unnatural hush fell over the crowd, and then a 13th chime. Lower, deeper, not metallic, but organic, like bone against stone. The congregation didn't gasp. They didn't panic. They simply stood, turned in unison, and began to sing. It wasn't a hymn. It was something else, a chant that no one had rehearsed, but everyone seemed to know. Their voices layered over one another, weaving into a harmony that vibrated against the walls. Bishop Kenrick paled. One of his assistants whispered, "They're already under." He meant the town, the entire congregation, entranced, conditioned ritually bound. Father O'Malley emerged from the sacristy like a storm wrapped in flesh. He wore vestments of black and crimson, embroidered with symbols that shimmered with every step. He said nothing at first. He only raised his hands, and the altar boys stepped forward from the shadows. 7 of them, Michael, Tommy, Liam, Brian, Davy, Timothy, and Patrick. Their faces were blank, their bodies moving in exact synchrony. They formed a circle around the altar and began the procession down the center aisle, chanting in a tongue that hadn't been heard on earth for centuries. O'Malley followed, eyes locked on the bishop. And then, in a voice that no longer pretended to be human, he spoke. "You have no dominion here. Francis, this ground was not consecrated for your Christ. It was taken, buried, and forgotten until I remembered the words, the bones, the door." The words struck the sanctuary like a crack of thunder, though no sound followed, just a pressure that built in the chest, as if the air itself had been taken hostage. Bishop Kenrick stood slowly, his hands hidden within the folds of his robe, and addressed O'Malley not with outrage, but with deliberate calm. "You were never ordained, or," he said, "you never carried the apostolic mark." But O'Malley smiled, a slow, unsettling curl that stretched his face just a fraction too far. "Ordination is for men," he replied. "I serve what came before men, before language, before breath." His voice shifted with each sentence, overlapping itself like a chorus of voices trapped in a single throat. The altar boys circled the black stone, their movements mechanical, eyes shining like polished obsidian. Patrick walked among them now, indistinguishable from the rest, his soul all but eclipsed. The bishop made his move. With a nod to his assistants, he stepped forward and opened the envelope James had been given earlier, an ancient rite, handwritten in Latin and something far older. Not an exorcism, a binding, a ritual pulled from the darkest corner of church archives, meant for things that did not belong to flesh, but had learned to wear it. He began to recite, voice steady despite the growing hum in the room. The low, thrumming pulse that came not from any organ, but from the walls themselves. The floor vibrated. Candles sputtered and dimmed. O'Malley flinched just slightly, but enough for James to see it. The creature was not invincible. Not here. Not now. The chanting from the congregation faltered. Some fell to their knees. Others clutched their heads as if the sound in the bishop's voice collided with something inside their minds. And the altar boys, they stopped. Mid-step, frozen, like dolls with the strings cut. Patrick gasped, as if surfacing from deep water, eyes wild and terrified, hands trembling. O'Malley's form began to change, not in a theatrical way, no flames or howling winds, but a slow disintegration of disguise. His skin thinned, stretched. His hair fell away like ash. Eyes opened where none should be, at his temples, his palms, the hollow of his neck. And still, the bishop spoke. The bishop's voice rose, not in volume but in depth, like a blade sinking deeper with each syllable. The binding words echoed through the sanctuary, bouncing off the stone walls and tearing through the invisible net O'Malley had cast over the town. The creature hissed an unholy, high-pitched sound like steam escaping a wound. Its form buckled, not collapsing, but unraveling. The illusion of flesh peeled away in layers, revealing something raw and seething beneath, something that shimmered like oil on water, and shifted constantly, too quickly for the human eye to settle on. The altar cracked beneath its feet, and the candles around it exploded into smoke. The congregation began to scream, not in panic, but in pain, as if something inside them was being pulled taut and severed. The years of influence, the spiritual hooks embedded deep in their minds, were being torn loose all at once. Mothers clutched their children. Men fell to the floor, weeping or convulsing. The spell was breaking, but not cleanly. O'Malley staggered, then roared in a voice that shattered what little glass remained in the stained windows above. He reached toward the altar boys, but they were no longer his. The spell had loosened its grip. Michael collapsed, then Tommy, then Liam. One by one, the boys dropped, gasping, their bodies racked with shudders as the parasite was driven out of them. Only Patrick remained standing, his eyes locked on the thing that had nearly claimed him. "I see you now," he whispered. O'Malley lunged, impossibly fast, but Kenrick was faster. The bishop drew a small relic from his vestments, a carved obsidian cross etched with sigils James did not recognize, and slammed it to the ground. The air shattered like glass, and from the circle of Latin scrawled in chalk and ash beneath the altar, light surged upward like a geyser. O'Malley screamed a sound that didn't come from his throat, but from every corner of the room, from the wood, from the stone, from the bones buried deep beneath the church. For a moment, he was everything towering, writhing, full of mouths and memory. Then, in a flash of darkness so dense it felt like falling, he was gone. Silence returned, but not peace, just silence. The sanctuary was left in ruins. Smoke clung to the air, thick with ash and the sickly sweet scent of burned wax and old incense. The altar had split clean down the center, exposing a hollow beneath the stone, where bones small, brittle, and unmistakably human were packed in concentric circles around a dark well that pulsed like a heart. Bishop Kenrick dropped to his knees, exhausted, muttering prayers under his breath, not for salvation, but for containment. Patrick lay curled beside the shattered relic, trembling, his eyes flicking open and shut as if he's caught between two worlds. James knelt beside him, not touching, just watching. afraid that even the softest contact might pull his son back toward whatever horror had nearly claimed him. Of the 7 altar boys, 5 never woke. Their bodies remained intact, unmarked but empty. No breath, no soul, just the shell of what had once been children. Their parents would be told it was fever, a sudden sickness, anything but the truth. The 2 survivors, Patrick and Timothy, were taken into the bishop's care immediately, removed from Sacred Heart and relocated to a monastery in Ohio, where the church could monitor them and offer whatever healing it could. James was allowed one goodbye. Patrick clung to him briefly, whispered, "Don't let it wake again," and was led away, his hands still shaking. Timothy said nothing. He hadn't spoken a single word since the ritual ended. The church was deconsecrated by order of the diocese. Everything candles, hymnals, vestments was burned in a massive pyre behind the building. The basement was sealed with concrete, its entrance bricked over, and the rectory was demolished within a week. No one was allowed inside again. The official report filed with Rome described a case of mass hysteria triggered by psychological stress, malnutrition, and extreme religious fervor. The deaths were classified as tragic, but natural. The bishop's personal report, written in a cipher only a few Vatican archivists could decode, was locked in the secret archives, labeled under a category used for events the church considered too dangerous for history. Sacred Heart itself unraveled. Families moved away. The town shrank. By the next census, half the population had vanished. The earth swallowed the story, but not the stain, because even after the altar cracked and the false priest dissolved into darkness, something remained. Something deep, something quiet, something patient. For a time, it seemed the horror had been buried for good. St. Joseph's stood empty, its silhouette a black tooth against the hills, avoided even by the most fearless of children. Nature reclaimed the cemetery, first vines growing wild over cracked gravestones, birds refusing to nest in its trees. Locals began to speak of Sacred Heart only in hushed tones, if at all, referring to it simply as the old ground. No new priest was ever assigned. No new church was built. The Diocese of Pittsburgh quietly redirected its resources, quietly erased records, and quietly reminded those involved that silence was, above all, holy. It was an unspoken pact. The truth had been confronted, and now it must be contained. But time, as always, is not a lock. In 1923, over 70 years later, Sacred Heart's last standing structure, the church itself, was finally slated for demolition to make way for a new county courthouse. The workers tasked with tearing down the old stone building had no knowledge of its history, only that it was old, hollow, and standing in the way. But as they dismantled the lower floor and began excavating the foundation, they uncovered something not on the plans, a sub-basement, sealed in concrete that cracked like glass under modern tools. Inside, they found more chambers carved deep into the earth. And within those chambers, relics not cataloged by any church, symbols that didn't match any known Christian tradition, bones, dozens of them, small, arranged in ritual circles. The lead-lined box was found beneath the altar site, hidden within the collapsed stone. Inside were the handwritten pages of Bishop Kenrick's personal journal. Sealed correspondence marked Confidential Ecclesiastica, and a single photograph, blurred, grainy, but unmistakable. It showed Father O'Malley standing at the center of his altar boys, all of them facing the camera with expressions too blank to be innocent. The box was handed over to county authorities, who, upon realizing what they had, immediately contacted the diocese. What happened next followed the same pattern. The site was sealed again. The findings declared structural anomalies, and the records locked away under state historical exemptions. But rumors began to spread. Workers spoke of tools that went missing, whispers that echoed from the stone, and frost forming on walls where no cold should reach. The courthouse was built over that hollow earth anyway. Concrete poured atop the old sanctuary, fluorescent lights installed above the stone where boys once whispered secrets they didn't understand. For a while, everything seemed normal. Legal proceedings were held. Bureaucrats shuffled papers, and the land pretended to forget. But something festered beneath. Employees began to complain of headaches that worsened the longer they stayed inside. Clerks reported dreams of bells ringing 13 times, of children walking the corridors barefoot, humming songs they'd never heard before. Electrical systems failed inexplicably. Foundation cracks reappeared no matter how many times they were patched. And always the cold. A lingering, unnatural chill in the basement archives. Even in summer, like the earth itself hadn't warmed in over 100 years. In 1989, a janitor named Robert Langley disappeared during a routine night shift. His flashlight was found still lit, resting on a perfectly folded courthouse flag. Deep beneath the records room, a single wet footprint bare. Small, childlike, was preserved in dust beside it. Authorities ruled it a workplace accident. But no one could explain why the building's security footage cut out for exactly 13 minutes that night. Or why. In the days after, the janitor's widow received a letter in the mail, no return address, postmarked from a town that no longer existed, containing only one sentence the altar remembers. The courthouse was finally decommissioned in 2003 after a series of unexplained fires and the abrupt resignation of nearly half its staff. The official reason was structural instability. But those who worked there knew better. The building didn't collapse. It rejected them. Since then, the site has remained fenced off. Its ownership caught in legal disputes no one seems eager to resolve. Local teens dare one another to jump the fence on Halloween. But few stay longer than a few minutes. The wind feels wrong inside. The silence too dense. And every so often, someone claims to hear at the bell. That 13th toll. Faint, distant, like a memory trying to claw its way back into the world. Sacred Heart may have been paved over, renamed, erased from maps. But something was never buried. It waits. Beneath law. Beneath faith. Beneath the stories we tell to keep ourselves from staring too long into the dark. In 2014, a team of amateur urban explorers uploaded a grainy video to a now defunct YouTube channel. Their goal had been to document forgotten civic buildings in rural Pennsylvania, abandoned schools, rail stations, and finally, the long-sealed courthouse in West Emmeline County. They cut through the chain-link fence under moonlight, descended through a broken basement window, and began their exploration with laughter and cheap flashlights. The first half of the footage showed nothing remarkable: dusty corridors, broken furniture, the skeletal remains of file cabinets. But 23 minutes in, something changed. The group entered a section of the basement where the floor abruptly shifted from concrete to stone. The air fogged the camera lens, though their breath didn't show. The laughter stopped. And then one of them whispered, "Do you hear that?" It was faint, but it was there, the sound of chanting. Not loud, not even close, but below them, beneath the stone, the same rhythm that had once echoed under candlelight in St. Joseph's. One of the boys, his voice shaken but still trying to sound brave, said, "It's just a drain pipe." Another whispered, "No, it's Latin. That's Latin." The footage ended abruptly, mid-sentence, when the screen cut to black and the audio was swallowed by a low, vibrating hum. Authorities found their equipment 2 days later, neatly placed near the courthouse entrance. The explorers themselves were found scattered over a 3-mile radius, naked, disoriented, and unable to recall how they got there. One had scratches on his arms that formed deliberate geometric patterns. Another had gone completely blind, though no physical damage to his eyes was found. In interviews, they could describe only fragments, a staircase that descended endlessly, a room of mirrors that didn't reflect, a boy standing in the dark, whispering prayers into a wall. But the detail that all of them remembered was the voice. Not loud, but deep. Not angry, but patient. A voice that asked them a question each in their own minds. Would you bleed to remember? Most refused to elaborate. One, when pressed, simply said, "It didn't need our bodies, just the invitation." The video was taken down within 48 hours. The channel disappeared. And one of the boys, 6 months later, was found building a small altar in his backyard. When police questioned him, he said, "He's only waiting for someone to finish what was started." That's the true nature of what was unleashed beneath St. Joseph's. It doesn't die. It adapts. It doesn't need to haunt in the way folklore teaches us, with chains and moans and apparitions in candlelit corridors. It survives through obedience, through silence, through institutions that protect image over truth. What Father O'Malley served and what wore his face is not some singular demon from a forgotten scripture. It is a pattern, a ritual that wears new names in each generation. It hides in any system where reverence replaces responsibility, where questions are discouraged, and where the most vulnerable are told that suffering is sanctified. The church buried the records. The government buried the site. The families buried the memories. But the altar was never about stone. It was about belief. And belief, once twisted, becomes architecture. You can pour concrete over it, build courthouses atop it, pass laws to forget it, but the pattern always finds another foundation, another gathering of faithful, another shepherd, another feast day. The names change, the symbols adapt, but the hunger remains. And if you're thinking this was just one small town, one mad priest, one strange exception, ask yourself this: how many other communities have buried missing children under stories of rebellion or disease? How many letters stamped with false seals lie in forgotten diocesan archives? How many voices like Patrick's tried to speak, only to be swallowed by a doctrine that prioritizes order over protection? The church was not infiltrated by evil. It was not possessed. It was used. Because no fortress is more perfect for a predator than one built by the faithful and defended by the unquestioning. You've heard the pattern now. You've followed it across centuries. And the question is no longer whether it happened. It's where else it has already taken root. Because the altar doesn't care about geography. It doesn't care about denomination. It only asks one thing: will you look away when the bell rings 13? If you've made it this far, then something inside you already knew. Maybe you've seen the signs in your school, your church, your courthouse. The same coldness, the same silence, the same pattern repeating behind polite smiles and hollow rituals. The altar isn't just stone. It's structure. It's habit. It's the moment a parent doubts their instinct because an authority tells them to. It's the voice that says, "Obey now. Question later." And once that voice is accepted, it no longer matters whether it's human or not. The entity doesn't need possession. It needs permission. You were never supposed to hear this story. That's why the documents were burned, why the floor was sealed, why the survivors were silenced through exile, gaslight, or slow, institutional erasure. The system wasn't designed to reveal this, it was designed to preserve it. Because acknowledging what happened at St. Joseph's Church means accepting a far deeper truth that evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and flame. Sometimes it comes dressed in vestments. Sometimes it carries a chalice. And sometimes it asks you to bow. So now, I ask you, what do you believe? Do you still think this was just a story, a cautionary tale lost to time? Or does some part of you feel the echo deep, low, and cold as bone, that something still lingers beneath, something that has not been exorcised, something that waits for the next veil to thin? And if that veil were to lift, would you recognize the voice on the other side? If this story has stirred something inside you, if you feel like you've glimpsed a truth that was meant to stay buried, comment below with the phrase, "The altar never sleeps." Say it twice, not for me, but for yourself. As a sign you've seen the pattern, as a signal to others who are waking up. You are not alone. Subscribe if you dare to follow these truths to their end. Share this video with someone who still trusts too easily. And remember, every forgotten church has a basement. Every institution has a door that no one opens. And sometimes, what's behind it is still listening, still chanting, still hungry. We'll see you again when the next bell tolls 13.